Welcome. Please take your seats as we will get started now. I would like to start by recognizing the great organizations that made this event possible. This debate is part of a 10-debate series that is put on around the country at campuses, generously funded by the Arthur N. Roop Foundation. The Arthur N. Roop Foundation is dedicated to achieving positive social change by shining the light of truth on critical and controversial issues. It pursues this mission through the support of scholarly studies, education, research, public debates like this one, and by the dissemination of results via a variety of media to all segments of the public. The event is also sponsored by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, ISI. My name is Rachel Georgeson, and I'm a regional director for ISI. ISI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan education organization that seeks to steep college students in an appreciation of the Western tradition, an education they may not be receiving on campus. ISI acts as a forum, network, and community for students and faculty members on the right. When I meet with faculty members and students to tell them about ISI, I always mention 3 ways that students can get involved. Our conferences, which occur in the summer and throughout the academic year, are a truly one-of-a-kind experience. We bring together students and professors with a passion for learning to discuss perennial questions of political philosophy. All on-site expenses are covered and stipends are available to make the trip affordable. We have a conference coming up in April on the 24th to the 26th in Casper, Wyoming. The deadline to apply is today, so if you're interested in attending, please speak with me after this. Second, student membership is a relatively new program we started for students that are passionate about ISI and would like to have greater access to all of our resources. And you can check out the flyer on your seat for more information about that. Finally, if you would like to get involved in ISI locally, we have a local ISI society here at Berkeley. The ISI Berk Society meets bi-monthly to discuss a text of the Western tradition. It attends lectures and events in the Greater Bay Area and hosts events like this one that you're here at today. In just a moment, I'll invite up Nihal Singh, the president of the ISI Berk Society. Nihal has been working tirelessly the past few months in order to make this event possible. Not only will he be introducing tonight's debaters, he will also be serving as moderator. Please join me in thanking Nihal for all of his hard work and welcoming him to the stage.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I will begin by introducing our 2 eminently qualified debaters. Arguing for the motion is Mark Thiessen. He is an author and commentator on foreign and domestic policy. A former member of the White House senior staff, he served as chief speechwriter to President George W. Bush and to Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. He authored New York Times bestseller, Courting Disaster, How the CIA Kept America Safe, the book How Barack Obama is Inviting the Next Attack, and co-authored Unintimidated, A Governor's Story and a Nation's Challenge with Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker. The Daily Telegraph named him one of the 100 most influential conservatives in America. Mr. Thiessen writes a weekly column for the Washington Post, is a regular commentator on Fox News' The Kelly File, and serves as a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Can we please give him a round of applause? Arguing against the motion is Mark Danner. He is a writer, journalist, and professor who has written for 3 decades on foreign affairs and international conflict. He has covered Central America, Haiti, Balkans, Iraq, and the greater Middle East, among other stories, and has written extensively about the development of American foreign policy during the late Cold War and afterward, with a focus on human rights violations during that time. His books include Torture and the Forever War, Stripping Bare the Body, Politics, Violence, War, and The Secret Way to War, the Downing Street Memo. Professor Danner was a longtime staff writer for The New Yorker and is a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books. Professor Danner is Chancellor's Professor of English and Journalism here at the University of California, Berkeley, and the James Clark Chance Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College. Let's give him a round, warm of applause as well. Of course, the motion for tonight's event is going to, I hope, prove both thought-provoking and capacious. There are a number of ways that the speakers can go with it, and really every word can be teased apart in quite a number of ways, so I'm sure this is going to be a very insightful event. The motion is as follows. Resolved. America should exercise its power and straighten out the Middle East. In order to determine who the winner and loser of this debate is, we are going to begin with a quick poll of where everyone is in the audience. I'm going to give you the option of voting for the motion, against it, or if you're undecided, you can also express that. So at this point, all the people who are for the motion, resolved, America should exercise its power and straighten out the Middle East, please go ahead and raise your hand. Thank you. Those of you against the motion, resolved, America should exercise its power and straighten out the Middle East, please raise your hands at this time. Thank you. And those of you who are undecided, please raise your hands at this time. The way that this is going to work is the side that is able to change the most votes in percentage point terms will be declared the winner. At this point, I'm going to walk you through the format for this evening's event. We're going to start with 10-minute opening statements by Mr. Thiessen, followed by Mr. Danner. After this, there will be 2 sets of 3-minute rebuttals. During the opening statements, I encourage you to write any questions that you have on the index cards that have been provided. Rachel will collect these, and these will serve as fodder for the rest of this evening's conversation. At this time, I'd like to introduce Mr. Danner. Or is yours? Mr. Thiessen, of course. And you can please go to the podium as well.
Thank you very much, Nahal. Appreciate the invitation to speak here tonight. I want to thank ISI for hosting us today, and also for the Berkeley Forum for hosting us today. I didn't know we were going to have a poll. To paraphrase William F. Buckley, if I win, I will demand a recount. And I thank Mark for being game today to have this discussion. It's been nice getting to know you and briefly beforehand, and I appreciate it. I want to talk to you today about why America is losing the battle against Islamic radicalism and why we need to use American power to turn that fight around. But before I do, I want to take you to another part of the world, the part of the world that actually Mark and I discovered we have a common love for, the country of Poland. Last summer, I took my 12-year-old son, Max, to Warsaw for the commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the Warsaw Uprising, which is when the Polish Home Army rose up and took back the Polish capital from the Nazi occupiers for 65 days. Many of the fighters were child insurgents. And my mother, his grandmother, was actually one of those child insurgents at an age when most children were running or going to school and playing dodgeball. She was dodging German sniper fire, running orders across the city. In that battle, 85% of the city was destroyed. 200,000 people were killed, civilians were killed, and 16,000 fighters lost their lives. That's almost the equivalent of the 9/11 attacks every day for 63 days. And as we walked through the city, I showed Max how on every street corner in Warsaw, virtually there's a plaque. I'm sure you've seen these, where they commemorate the people who had been lined up and shot and executed in that spot. And in some of these places, you can actually still stick your finger into the bullet holes that are still in the concrete or in the stones that are there. And after we did that, we rented a car and we drove south to Auschwitz. And I took him to see the camp where more than 1 million souls died. Max is named for St. Maximilian Kolbe, who was the Polish priest who offered his life for another prisoner. And we visited Father Kolbe's cell, where he was slowly starved to death by the Nazis. We visited the crematorium, where his body was burned along with many other victims. We walked the train tracks, where Joseph Mengele picked his victims, and we saw the leftover suitcases and eyeglasses and hair and children's toys that were left behind by the victims. And the hard thing for me to do, the hardest thing I had to do, was to explain to this 12-year-old child, why did the world's democracies allow this to happen? Why did the world's democracies not stop the Nazi regime, Nazi movement in its infancy, before it indoctrinated millions of people with its hateful ideology, took control of a great power, invaded foreign lands, and built the death camps like the one we were visiting in Auschwitz? And the depressing answer I had to give him was for the same reason that the world's democracies have done nothing to stop the rise of the Islamic State. After spending a day in Auschwitz, I went back with him to our hotel room, and I took out my laptop and I showed him some videos on the internet of the Islamic State and what it's doing. I was careful to choose which ones because he's only 12 years old. But I showed him a video of where the Islamic State, and unlike the Nazis who were actually embarrassed by their crimes and tried to destroy the evidence, the Islamic State puts these things up on Twitter and on video. They're very proud of them. And showed how they were took truckloads of hundreds of people, took them to a mass grave, shot them one by one, and pushed their bodies into a ditch. I showed him a video from Vice News about children being indoctrinated by the Islamic State, just like the Nazis had the Hitler Youth camps where they would teach German children that all non-Aryans were subhuman and worthy of extermination. The Islamic State teaches young Muslim children in the areas of controls that all non-Muslims are subhuman and should be exterminated. And we looked at one young boy who looks in the camera and he says, "In the name of God, my name is Dawood, I'm 14 years old, I'd like to join the Islamic State and kill with them, because they fight the infidels and the apostates." Another one looked in the camera, "We promise you car bombs and explosives, I swear to God we will divide America in two." These were kids who were my son Max's age. And ISIS has not yet developed the capability to kill on the scale commensurate with its hatred, but it's committing horrific crimes against humanity every single day. Beheading unbelievers, sticking decapitated heads on posts, burning people alive in cages, burying women and children alive, crucifying its opponents. During the World Cup, ISIS tweeted a photo of a decapitated head with this message: "This is our ball, it's made of skin, #WorldCup." This is the enemy we're facing. This is the same evil my mother fought 70 years ago in Poland in a different guise. And today, some people would like to believe that the Islamic State's offensive in Iraq is, in the words of Neville Chamberlain, a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know little. In fact, the Islamic State has a messianic vision of building a totalitarian Islamic empire, which they call a caliphate, which is encompassing all current and foreign Muslim lands stretching from Europe to North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. They may never see that vision fully realized, but they can wreak an awful lot of destruction in the process. And already we see this threat from the Islamic State spreading. In recent weeks, there have been horrific attacks in Tunisia and Yemen. They've beheaded Christians in Libya. They have established cells in Europe, and they're accumulating resource to carry out more attacks around the world. The RAND Corporation recently did a study, and they reported, and this is a quote, "Currently, the Islamic State brings in more than $1 million a day in revenue and is now the richest terrorist group on the planet. A conservative calculation suggests the Islamic State may generate $100 to $200 million this year." To put that in perspective, the 9/11 attacks cost $500,000 to Al-Qaeda. So this is a powerful state that is building up the resources by which to attack us here at home. And the worst part of it is, this all could have been prevented. The rise of ISIS today is a direct result of decisions that were made in the White House. in the last few years. When President Obama took office in 2009, he inherited a pacified Iraq where the terrorists had been defeated both militarily and ideologically. Militarily, thanks to the surge, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which changed its name to the Islamic State during the surge, was driven from its strongholds. It established an Anbar in other provinces. Its leader, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, had been killed by U.S. Special Operations Forces. It controlled no territory. Ideologically, however, even more importantly, the terrorists had suffered a popular rejection. Iraq was supposed to be the place where the Islamic State came to rally the Sunni masses to drive America out, and instead what happened was the Sunni masses joined with America to drive the Islamic State out. So they were rejected by the very people they claimed to be the vanguard of. So this was both a military and ideological victory. President Obama took that inheritance and squandered it with three disastrous decisions. First, he withdrew all U.S. forces from Iraq. He took our boot off of the terrorists' necks and unplugged the intelligence and special operations network that was keeping them down. Second, he stood by and did nothing in Syria, a decision which Hillary Clinton has said created a vacuum that allowed the jihadists to fill. And they took that vacuum in Syria and turned it into a grand central station of jihad, where they attracted people from all over the world to come and join the Islamic State in its battle to retake the territory it lost in Iraq. The third decision he made, which was disastrous, was while the Islamic State massed its armies on the border of Iraq, he, for over a year, rejected the pleas of the Iraqi government to carry out airstrikes to take them out before they came in and took over cities and populated areas. He stood by and did nothing while the terrorists overran the country. And had he answered those requests when the Islamic State was still massing in the Iraqi desert, in the western desert, away from population centers, they would have never been able to take over Mosul and take over Tikrit and control all the territory they control today. Now, why did President Obama refuse to act? Well, one reason, I believe, is because it would have been an admission that his decision to withdraw from Iraq was a disaster, that in the absence of American forces, the terrorists had made a comeback. He was going to be the president who ended the war in Iraq, not the one who stayed there and kept American troops in there to keep the peace. So the president stuck his head in the sand and refused to take the Islamic State seriously. And we know this because in Mark's journal where he used to write, in the New Yorker, President Obama gave an interview where he said he dismissed them. This was in January 2014, while they were taking over the city of Fallujah. He called them JV terrorists, who we shouldn't really take very seriously, and he said that what they were doing was not a direct threat to us or something we have to wade into. That was a big mistake. The result was when President Obama took office, the terrorists had been driven from their strongholds, and now they control a territory the size of Great Britain. Iraq is turning today, because of these decisions, into what Afghanistan was in the 1990s, a safe haven from which the terrorists can plan attacks on the United States. They've got unprecedented levels of power, millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, and their caliph, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, has recently warned that they are coming after us. In an audio recording, he said, and I quote, "Our last message is to the Americans, soon we will be in direct confrontation, and the sons of Islam have prepared for such a day, so watch, for we are with you watching." That's pretty clear. It's only a matter of time before they follow through on these threats. Even Obama's own Attorney General, Eric Holder, told ABC News the rise of the Islamic State is, quote, "more frightening than anything I think I've seen as Attorney General," adding, 9/11 was something that kind of came out of the blue. This is a situation we can see developing. Now, I never thought I'd say this, but I agree with Eric Holder. And that's, we need to take the words of our enemies seriously. Throughout our history, our enemies have repeatedly told us what they intend to do, only to have us ignore those clear warnings. In the early 1900s, an exiled lawyer in Europe published a pamphlet called What Is to Be Done, in which he laid out his plans to launch a communist revolution in Russia. The world ignored Lenin's words and paid a terrible price. The Soviet Union killed millions of people and put the world on the brink of thermonuclear war. In the 1920s, a failed Austrian painter published a book in which he explained his intention to build an Aryan superstate in Germany, take revenge on Europe, and eradicate the Jews. The world ignored his words and paid a terrible price.
Mr.
And in the
your 10 minutes have elapsed.
I'll finish one last point and then we'll go. In the 1990s, Osama bin Laden made his intentions clear in 2 fatwas declaring war against America and explaining his plans to launch a global jihad. We ignored his words and the result was 9/11. So now the leader of ISIS has made his intentions clear, just like Lenin and Hitler and bin Laden before him. The question is, do we listen to his words and take his words seriously, or do we ignore his words and pay a terrible price again?
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank ISI, the organizers, for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Mr. Tyson, for coming out to enemy territory in Berkeley. It's very nice to meet you. The issues we're debating tonight are extremely important ones. I certainly agree about that. Couldn't be more important. In fact, I think what I should do is begin in the spirit of comity with where my debating partner and I unquestionably agreed, and that is his statement that the rise of the Islamic State is a direct result of decisions that were made in the White House. This is absolutely true, absolutely true. These decisions that were made in the White House in 2002 and 2003 to invade and occupy Iraq are what we see the result of today in the occupation of large parts of Iraq and large parts of Syria by a group that in fact American policy created. That is the Islamic State. There was no Islamic State before the American invasion and occupation. There was no fundamentalist movement in Iraq before the American occupation and invasion. In fact, it's a fascinating thing about our debate tonight. Our subject, resolve the United States should use its power and straighten out the Middle East. It's a fascinating thing that that subject could very well have been the subject in 2002, 2003, because this is precisely what people were telling us during the Bush administration in the wake of the attacks of September 11. I'm reminded that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And what you're being asked to believe now is that American power, which was used to straighten out the Middle East in 2003 up until 2011, when American troops were withdrawn as a result of an agreement signed by, oh, that was President Bush. Good heavens, that doesn't fit into the narrative. Yeah. President Bush signed the agreement to withdraw American troops from Iraq. You didn't hear that a moment ago. But the situation that we're seeing in the Middle East right now is a situation of, should we call it, creative destabilization, which was a phrase going around neoconservative circles in 2002, 2003. Bust up the Middle East, solve this problem, drain the swamp. And the invasion of Iraq was supposed to accomplish this. So the United States sent 150,000 American troops, invaded Iraq, and in several weeks the United States was in Baghdad, and what happened afterwards? Well, that was the combat phase. That was enormously successful. It was only the war phase, that is after it, in which there were problems. I covered the Iraq War. I was there on 4 different occasions for a number of weeks each time, wrote about it, reported from around the country, and it's fascinating to me to hear this version of Iraq that you've just heard here tonight. This version goes something like this. Obama came into office, the Iraq War was going fine, the surge had pacified the country completely, and then Obama withdrew the troops and threw away this glorious victory. Well, I remember it somewhat differently. The situation in Iraq in 2006, 2007, where 4,000 Iraqis were dying every month. 4,000 every month. Iraq is about 1/10 of the size of the United States. Imagine 40,000 Americans dying every month. It was a huge, enormous bloodbath. At that time, there were 140,000 American troops in the country. The surge added 28,000. And the surge did cut down on the level of killing. There's no question about it. But listen to the logic you've just heard. After President Bush withdrew all the troops, President Obama was supposed to keep in the country 10,000 troops. No one has ever talked about more than 10,000 having been left. The idea was to leave them in the country after the Americans departed. Now, what is the logic that tells us when 140,000 troops couldn't pacify Iraq, that 10,000 troops left there could? 10,000 troops, if Obama had only left them in Iraq, would have prevented the rise of the Islamic State. This is a complete fairy tale. You know how many policemen there are patrolling Manhattan? 40,000. You think 10,000 in the entire country of Iraq were going to pacify that country and prevent the rise of the Islamic State? But don't take my word for it. Perhaps you could take the word of General Petraeus, who ran the surge, the military genius who ran the surge. The proximate cause of Iraq's unraveling, he told the Washington Post, was the increasing authoritarian, sectarian, and corrupt conduct of the Iraqi government and its leader after the departure of the last U.S. combat forces in 2011. The actions of the Iraqi prime minister undid the major accomplishment of the surge. They alienated the Iraqi Sunnis and once again created in the Sunni areas fertile fields for the planting of the seeds of extremism, essentially opening the door to the takeover of the Islamic State. A great deal of responsibility lies with Prime Minister Maliki, he said. And General Petraeus went on, as for the U.S. role, could all of this have been averted if we had kept 10,000 troops here? I honestly don't know. He then says that he wished we could have tested the proposition and kept a substantial force on the ground, which was never in question. So the Islamic State, which I agree is a dangerous, noxious, horrible force. They behead people, they're great at creating terrorist spectacles that scare the bejesus out of everybody, rose as a result of exactly this proposition. America should use its power and straighten out the Middle East. Precisely that in 2002. And the question is, should we learn the limits of American power? The United States has the greatest military power in the history of the world. When you talk about the ability to destroy things, the United States could destroy any country on the globe. But that is not the only way to judge what power is. Another way to judge what power is do you have the strength to build something in place of what you destroy? And in that area, the United States' power is distinctly limited. Why, indeed, were those troops withdrawn in 2011? Because the American public was exhausted. Because George Bush signed that agreement. Why? He was reflecting the sentiments of the American public. Why has the United States not gotten involved in Syria? At a point 2 years ago, President Obama was going to bomb the Syrians because of their use of chemical weapons. He was going to go to Congress for approval. Why didn't he do that? Because Congress would have turned him down. Because the temperament of the American public now is not to get involved in yet another war in the Middle East in which the unintended consequences will leave us in a worse position than when we started. Don't want to take my word for that? Why don't we listen to a conservative whose view I quite respect, former Secretary of Defense Robert M. Gates, who was hired as a replacement for Mr. Tyson's former boss, Donald Rumsfeld at the Department of Defense. Robert Gates said, in my opinion, any future defense secretary who advises the president to again send a big American land army into Asia or into the Middle East or Africa should have his head examined, as General MacArthur so delicately put it. That's from Robert M. Gates. I'll give you a quote from another conservative, Richard Burr, who is now the chairman. He's a senator from North Carolina. He's the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He was asked about what to do about Yemen. Who do you attack, he asked. Do you attack the Houthis? Do you attack ISIL? Do you attack Al-Qaeda? The difficulty is that everyone in Yemen that's in conflict is an enemy of ours. When you are not convinced that by your actions you can make things better, do not invade, do not occupy, do not bomb. The United States has a policy now which is to gather a coalition together to face off against the Islamic State and to support them with air power. That is what it's been doing since September of last year. They have indeed halted the advance of the Islamic State in northern Iraq, and they are slowly pushing them back. I see I have 1 minute left. Let me say that when we talk about unintended consequences, we can look at the fact that our allies in Iraq now are the Iranians. They are the troops on the ground who are helping, the generals on the ground who are leading our former Iraqi allies. Why is that? Unintended consequence of the invasion, the George W. Bush invasion and occupation of Iraq, it empowered Iran, not just in Iraq, where it now holds sway in half the country, but in Syria and in Lebanon. Lebanon already it had power, but in Syria as well. So when we think about military power, we shouldn't just look at our arsenal. We shouldn't just look at our power to destroy. We should look at the fact that war always has vast unintended consequences. As the great diplomat George F. Kennan said, in war you always know where you start, you never know where you're going to end up. And if you don't know precisely what you're going to achieve with military force, it doesn't do well to stand here and compare the Islamic State to the Soviet Union, or the Islamic State to Nazi Germany, or to talk about the Islamic State in the context of Auschwitz. This is rhetoric, inflammatory rhetoric, that leads us away from a precise calculation of what exactly we would try to achieve with the United States' vaunted military power. And I would say to you tonight, to all of you, that indeed, if you don't remember the past, you are condemned to repeat it. And when we talk about the past, we are talking about a very, very recent past. We are talking about basically 10, 12 years ago, when we're having this very debate. All we have to do is look at the Middle East, look at the structure of power there, and say, did the Iraq War lead the United States into a better position? Did it promote American interests, or did it lead us into a much worse position? And I would say to you tonight that the answer to any dispassionate observer is absolutely clear. This was a catastrophic mistake, and we are being asked tonight to commit yet another one. Thank you very much.
So much to work with, so little time. So, question for the audience. How many people think if George W. Bush had been president in 2011, we would have withdrawn every single American soldier out of Iraq? Thank you. So, the idea that all Barack Obama was doing was carrying out George W. Bush's withdrawal from Iraq is absolutely erroneous, and you know it.
He did sign that agreement.
No. So the status of force. So you have to understand, in any country where you have foreign forces, it's an unnatural situation, and there's political cost to it. In Japan, we have problems in Okinawa because of American presence in that country. They're political problems. So there's a political cost if you're an Iraqi leader to being welcoming to an American presence of a foreign troops in your country. The Iraqis desperately wanted the Americans to stay, okay? And you're wrong when you say that no one was contemplating more than 10,000 troops. In fact, the US military, General Austin, recommended 30,000 troops. This is how this happened, okay? So there are two powers that are in play in Iraq. There's the Iranians, which are just across the border, as you can see on the map there, and who are a huge influence in that country and want the Americans to leave. And then there's the Americans. The Iraqi government wants the Americans to stay, all right? General Austin recommends 30,000 troops. President Obama says, you've got to be kidding me, not happening. So he says, come up with options. So General Austin comes back to him with options of 20,000, 15,000, or in extremis, 10,000 as a bare minimum floor. President Obama goes with 10,000. He then goes to the Iraqi government and begins negotiating with the Iraqi government, and the Iraqi, in the midst of the negotiations, lowers that to between 3,000 to 5,000. So if you're an Iraqi leader, and the Iranians are lobbying your legislators, they are bribing people, they are threatening people to vote against a status of forces agreement. And what do you see? You see the United States running for the door. You see a president who doesn't want to stay, who's offering you 3,000 to 5,000 troops, which can't do anything, as opposed to 30,000, which could, according to our military. And what do you say? It's not worth the cost. So they decided to make their bed with the Iranians, because we were leaving, we were running for the exits. President Obama said, I'm turning the page. We've got to focus on nation building here at home. They hear all that in Iraq, and so they say the Americans are running for the exits, we've got to make our bed with the Iranians. So it wasn't the Bush administration that turned Iraq into an Iranian client, it was the American withdrawal. Right now, on the ground, in this vaunted offensive that Mark is praising so much, the United States Air Force is providing air cover for the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Quds Force and Iranian-backed Shia militias, which were responsible for 1/3 of the American casualties in Iraq. We are their air force. These are the people that we have subcontracted the battle against ISIS to. So let's say, so Iran is the Shia face of Islamic radicalism that wants to destroy us and wants to get a nuclear weapon and dominate the Middle East. ISIS is the Sunni face. So let's say we help the Iranians win. Is that a victory? It is? To have the Iranians take over Iraq?
Sorry, I have to interrupt you, but
No,
because
no.
I'm Iraqi.
Okay.
You said a lot of wrong information about Iraq because I have a paper
Yes.
from the Iraqi.
There's going to be questions at the end.
And
Can you
Please,
wait?
we have audience participation during the question and
Yes,
answer.
you'll have a chance to ask your questions. Don't
I'm
worry.
not listening to information.
Okay. Iraq is going to become an Iranian client state, and what you have now is Iran is on the march across the Middle East. You have Iran brags about being in control of 4 Arab capitals: Baghdad, Damascus, Sana'a. And so they are expanding their influence using waging jihad through proxies like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis in Yemen, and all the rest. Now, the other point that Mark made, which I think needs to be addressed, is he said that that ISIS is a creation of the Iraq War. You have to go back a little further than 2003 to if we really want to start going into history and laying blame. ISIS is an offshoot of Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda did not emerge from the Iraq War. It is. ISIS was Al Qaeda in Iraq. And so if you want to look at the responsibility for what happened, how Al Qaeda grew, starting back into, and this is Republican and Democratic administration. 1983, the U.S. withdrawal from Beirut, which Osama bin Laden wrote, inspired him for the 9/11 attacks because it made him believe that if America got hit, that we would cut and run.
Mr. Danner, your rebuttal will begin now.
Okay, thank you.
You'll have 6 minutes.
6 minutes.
We're condensing to 2, 3.
Oh, you are? Okay.
6.
Oh, yes, okay.
6 now.
I wondered about that. Thank you. You know, there's some fantasies being perpetrated here, and you get to a point in a debate like this, who are you going to believe? I would say about the surge and this fantasy that, oh my gosh, the surge in 2007 completely won the war. And then Obama came into office and he threw away the fruits of this glorious victory in Iraq. This is just nonsense. This is really nonsense. And the notion that, well, if Bush was president, he would have kept troops there. How many troops and for how long? It is true you had a general who recommended 30,000, there's no question about it. It is also true, by the way, that President Bush did sign the agreement that would remove every American troop from Iraq. That is absolutely the case. Look it up at your leisure. But this idea that actually Obama came in and frittered away the great fruits of victory just is a fantasy. I cited the figures before about the number of troops in Iraq when the killing was at its worst, 140,000 American troops. The surge brought that up to 168,000. Under what construction, in reality, would a handful of American troops, whether 10,000 or even 30,000 if you'd like, be able to keep a lid on the country in that situation when 140,000 couldn't? This is a fantasy. It is a mythology. It's also a mythology to say, well, actually, ISIS is originally Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda in Iraq emerged out of the Iraq War. That is a historical fact. Zarqawi emerged out of the Iraq War. I mean, there is no question about this. You can talk about the roots of Al Qaeda. You can go back as far as you like. You can talk about Beirut in 1983. But you do reach a point where there are, in fact, historical facts that can be verified. The real question here is, what is Mr. Tyson proposing here? And the proposal is that the United States, I mean, I can quote him, don't just counter violent extremists, defeat them, he wrote in the Washington Post on February 23rd. When the world sees the Islamic State retreating and its leaders in orange jumpsuits boarding planes for Guantanamo Bay, it will know that the United States is the strong horse again, and suddenly the Islamic State's ideology will lose its current sheen. Soft power, when it is not backed by hard power, is just softness, and softness won't defeat the Islamic State. What are we talking about when we're talking about hard power? We're talking about American troops on the ground. So we're talking about, apparently, a reinvasion and reoccupation of Iraq. Doesn't that sound like a good idea? That's brilliant. Why didn't I think of that? A reinvasion and a reoccupation of Iraq, because things worked out so well the last time. When you look at this map, you can see Iran, you can see Iraq, and the fact is that Iran, in the lower half of the country of Iraq, holds ideological sway now. Why is that? Because the United States invaded, because eventually they had elections, because you had a Shia sympathetic government which took power, and very predictably, Iran is now the dominantly influential state in that part of Iraq. The other end, indeed, ISIS, a good part of ISIS holds power. There's no question about it. The United States has responded by assembling a coalition and supporting them with air power. It is true that the Iranians are influential on the ground, there's no doubt about it, but the alternative to that is indeed a reoccupation of Iraq by American forces. And whether or not my debating partner here would like to see that, the American people will not in a million years support it. You can bemoan the fact that President Obama is in the White House, but you cannot deny the fact that President Obama is in the White House in large part because of the distinct unpopularity of the Iraq War. He was the single major candidate who had opposed the war from the start. He said, I'm not a pacifist, I don't oppose all wars, I oppose dumb wars. And it seems to me that actually is a rather intelligent statement. Let's oppose dumb wars. The one thing I have not heard tonight is an actual proposal for a real policy in the Middle East to use American power. You know, Napoleon said, or is said to have said, you can do everything with a bayonet except sit on it. I realize that image is very vivid, don't think about it too much. What he meant by that is that military power, as I said in my opening remarks, is very good at destroying things, at blowing them up. It is not very good at establishing an enduring order. It is not very good at recalibrating a society and returning it to a state of stability. We see this in Afghanistan, we see this in Iraq, we see this in Yemen. How many times do we have to see it before we learn that even though we have these fancy weapons and this impressive military, there are many things, there are many uses to which we can put it which will leave us in a worse situation than when we started. It is the great catastrophe of the post-9/11 world that the Bush administration invaded and occupied Iraq, because it not only left the Middle East in the state it is today, and I agree with Mr. Tyson that the state is perilous in many ways, it also gave a great revivifying thrust to Al-Qaeda and movements like it around the world. Why? Because the United States, in invading and occupying Iraq, gave a proliferation of images of Americans shooting, beating, torturing, putting their boots on the back of Muslims. That is to say, by invading and occupying Iraq, the United States supplied telegenic proof of the fact that we are the caricature that they had made of us. So ideologically, it was an enormous boon to the very enemies that Mr. Tyson is warning us about. And I would suggest that if we're going to have slogans here, not a bad slogan is the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm. And the use of American power in the way that it's being proposed tonight, I can assure you, will do one thing absolutely, and that is it will add to the power of the enemies that Mr. Tyson is so eloquently denouncing. So let's not make things worse. Let's begin by not making things worse, and if you wonder about making things worse, about how that can happen, I ask you simply to cast your eye over recent history. Recent history has seldom given us a more vivid example of the United States using its military force to, in effect, make things worse and harm its own interests.
In the
Let's not
interest
do it
of
again.
time, I will now entertain 2 questions from the audience, after which we will move into closing statements. The 2
time to 6 minutes in the interest of time again. Yes, the gentleman raising his hand. If you can just stand and project your question, please.
Yes, Mark, you shook your head when you heard Al-Qaeda created ISIS. Why do you disagree?
You know, Al-Qaeda in the land of the two rivers, Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, was the original group, in Iraq during the Iraq War. But Al-Qaeda in the land of the two rivers was not created by core Al-Qaeda. It was created by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, a Jordanian, who eventually applied to Al-Qaeda to use the franchise name. I mean, not many people know it, but Al-Qaeda is like McDonald's. You have to actually apply to use their brand. And indeed, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi did in fact apply to use the brand name, and eventually it was called Al-Qaeda. But Al-Qaeda did not start. Core Al-Qaeda did not start the group known as Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. It was started separately. And this is not a controversial fact. This is just the history of it. So the idea that this came from Al-Qaeda is just wrong. It's just not right.
That's, what Mark just said is absolutely wrong. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was in Afghanistan with Al-Qaeda when we launched Operation Enduring Freedom. He traveled from Afghanistan to escape coalition forces to Iraq in 2002 with a dozen Al-Qaeda operatives and was in Baghdad before the Iraq War began. So to say, and in fact,
he wasn't in Baghdad. He was in Kurdistan.
No,
actually.
he was in Baghdad, and actually we even presented the Iraqi government with information about his whereabouts and asked them to turn him over before the war, and they wouldn't do it. So the idea, and as for him being not a franchise owner, KSM wasn't a member of Al-Qaeda when he planned the 9/11 attacks. And the reason he told us when he was in our custody, was because he wanted to have, if he pledged bayat to Osama bin Laden, then if bin Laden canceled the operation, he would have had to obey. So being a formal member of Al-Qaeda is not necessarily the currency, unless you think that KSM wasn't a member of Al-Qaeda when he launched 9/11, then that's a false narrative. So the reason they call themselves Al-Qaeda in Iraq is because they were Al-Qaeda in Iraq, okay? How did Al-Qaeda grow? It wasn't because of American engagement in the Middle East, it was because of American disengagement. It was because during the 1990s, terrorists repeatedly attacked us with impunity. It started out with the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, then the 1996 Khobar Towers bombing, then the 1998 attacks against our embassies in East Africa, then the 2000 attack against the USS Cole, none of which America responded to. We did exactly what Mr. Danner is proposing we do in the face of ISIS, which is stay out. Leave them alone.
That isn't what I proposed.
I'll now recognize
as people
one
here
more
will
question.
And
heard.
so the point is simply, and then is that when America lets dangers fester and doesn't do anything about them, the result is 9/11. The result comes back to haunt us here.
Let me answer that. Everyone here who has ears to hear has heard that I didn't propose that the United States do nothing. The United States is supporting a coalition against ISIS using its air power. It's launching airstrikes every day. Everyone here, I think, heard that, even if Mr. Tyson didn't. The question is it reasonable that the United States launch another ground war in the Middle East?
That's not what we're talking about. No one's proposed that. Have I proposed that? You said that I proposed
That seems
a
to be
reinvasion.
what I read your words.
That's not
it
what I
seems
said.
to be what you've written.
No. Look, if you talk
I'm
to...
sorry, so what are you proposing?
I'd be happy to tell you if you'd like.
Were people under the impression that we're talking about using American military power in
Oh,
the
I'm
Middle
talking
East?
about using American military power. I'm not talking about a reinvasion with hundreds of thousands of troops, which is what you attributed to me. You said I was proposing a reinvasion and reoccupation of Iraq, which is factually incorrect. I will tell you exactly what I support. I support exactly what President Obama's military commanders support. They need about 10,000 troops to go in there. They need special operations forces to be embedded with the Iraqi units so that they can go and engage in combat and improve their combat. They need forward air controllers, which are special operations Air Force guys that go in behind enemy lines and call in airstrikes. They need direct action teams, which are joint CIA and special operations teams that go after the leadership and take them out. And they need some Apache helicopters. About 10,000 troops, which ironically is what we were supposed to leave behind in the first place, which is the people that Mr. Danner says couldn't do anything. That's what our military commanders are recommending right now. President Obama has rejected the advice of his own military commanders in what's necessary to defeat these people. And so what we have here, the situation that Mr. Danner supports, is that we launch these pinprick airstrikes that are doing nothing on the ground. In fact, they are strengthening ISIS, because ISIS, President Obama says, we're going to degrade and destroy ISIS. And we bombed them for 6 months, and what's happened? Nothing. They're still in control. So the message they send to the world is, we're the strong horse, we can withstand the best the Americans can throw at us. They still control all their territory, and what does that do? That recruits people, because they seem to be the strong horse, not the weak horse.
Let me just add here, I know this is supposed to be the question period, but it seems to be a debate is continuing. Let me just add here that it is the usual format of sort of sidestepping into a military engagement that one doesn't intend, that one promises at the outset that it will be, to quote a writer just before the Iraq War, a cakewalk. That is to say, only 10,000 troops will be necessary to go in and defeat ISIS. It's going to be easy. In fact, if you just left these original 10,000 troops in 2011, we wouldn't have this problem to begin with. Only 10,000 troops. Just like at the beginning of the Iraq War, you know what, we can go in with 80,000. No problem. It's going to be a cakewalk. This is the usual thing you hear before a catastrophic military intervention, which is that it's easy. Americans will go in a few thousand, all opposition will fall before them. It's nonsense. We've heard it before, way back to Vietnam.
I will take one more question, after which we will have two strictly 2 minutes closing statements. Yes.
I need to actually do a clarification. First of all, the Iraqi people, they don't want you to come to Iraq and interfere. Second of all, the popular force, which is the Shia, and do you know what is this? Of course you don't, so you don't have the right to talk about the Shia. Basically, the Shia took over Amarli city with 4,000 soldiers. They took over BG with 2,000 soldiers. They took over...
Please, can you rephrase this in the form of a question?
No, excuse me, because this is misleading information. He is giving us a misleading information, and as an Iraqi
After
citizen...
the event, go back and forth, but if we don't have a question, we'll have to move on. Is there another question?
Well, why don't you let him ask me? Do you have a
Thank you
question?
so
much.
Do you have a
Thank you.
question?
No, do you have a
My
question?
question is, if we want a military intervention in Iraq, what we need is 80,000 soldiers to go over Mosul. If you can do that, then you're welcome to do that. If not, then please stay out. That is the thing.
So the Shia, the militias that you're talking about, the fighters are fully owned, operated, and funded by the Iranian regime and the Quds Force, General Soleimani, who is one of the most brutal terrorist leaders in the world. Qasem Soleimani is not a terrorist. Well, can we agree, Mark, that Qasem Soleimani is a terrorist?
Is he?
Can we agree on that?
He's certainly a militia guerrilla leader, no question about it.
We can't agree that he's a terrorist?
I wouldn't.
You wouldn't go that far.
Interesting.
Interesting. Well, that tells you a lot.
Well, we
Look,
love
here's the situation we have. Okay. So Mark says that 10,000 troops won't do it, but the pinprick airstrikes we're doing are just fine, right? So he's perfectly fine with us just bombing ISIS a little bit and letting them control territory and stay where they are, or depending on the Iranian Revolutionary Guard to do the fight against them, so that we have we hand over Iraq from one branch of Shia Islamic radicalism to another. That's his solution. This is a danger to our country. The leader of ISIS has said they are coming after us. Okay? So if we have learned anything from the experience of 9/11, is that we cannot let them continue to do what they're doing in Iraq today and ignore the threat, because it's going to come back to haunt us. We do not need to reinvade Iraq. We do not need hundreds of thousands of troops. No one is suggesting that. The Iraqi government can fight its own battles. They need our assistance. They need our support. They need air power. They need some enablers on the ground so that they don't have to go to Qasem Soleimani, who is a terrorist, to do it for us. That is the situation we have in Iraq today.
You're being disrespectful to the Shia, you know that?
At
No,
this
I'm being
point,
disrespectful to the
Dr. Banner may
Iranians.
respond to the question, and after that, we're going to move into
And you
the
have to
closing
review
statements.
the Islamic State leader. In 18 November, he said, kill the Shia, kill the Saud and his soldier, and then kill the Crusader. So if you work at the US government, you need to be aware of the Shia militia and what the Shia people want.
All right.
And next time, it's
Don't
respectful
remember
to have
it.
Iraqi people.
And you and Bush would have made great Nazis.
My mother fought the Nazis, sir. Thank you. Dave
I'm
Barry
sorry.
once had a column where he said, when you're losing an argument, compare your enemy to Adolf Hitler.
I'm sorry, where am I supposed to be summing up for?
You'll have an opportunity to respond or say anything that you'd like to say, following which we are going to have 2-minute closing statements, beginning with you,
Ladies
and then
and-
Mr. Thiessen.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. I think we're getting to the closing. I'm supposed to respond to the gentleman who unfortunately has already left. I think his remarks about disrespect are quite indicative of something. And I've heard, thank you. We did not arrange that beforehand. His remarks about disrespect are quite indicative of something. And it's something that I've seen in Iraq, which is when you invade a country without knowing very much about it and think you're going to be able to change it by killing people, because that's what an invasion and an occupation is. You lose very quickly the respect of those people on the ground. In fact, most of them you've lost the respect before you've even entered. It was a fantasy that the United States would be welcomed with sweets and flowers in Iraq. What is certain is that the politics of the countries that we're looking at here, not just Iraq, but Syria, Iran, and others, are complex. Their sectarian differences, their economic and political differences. The United States, again and again, has blundered into situations that it scarcely understands, under the mistaken belief that its military power will be welcomed, and that its attempts at social engineering, based very often on ignorance, will be successful. Very often the United States, despite what we can ascribe to it as good intentions, if you like, has failed. And I am sympathetic to the gentleman who left, because I saw this attitude again and again in Iraq. I remember somebody saying to me, Mr. Danner, the Americans have made their own enemies here. The Americans have created their own enemies here by how they've behaved, by what they've done, by the carelessness of their killing. So I go back to George F. Kennan's point that when it comes to a war, when it comes to unleashing ferocious violence, using modern industrial strength weapons, you know where you're starting. You never know where you're going to end up. Because the people who you're killing, whose families you are killing, end up having a vote. And their political recalcitrance, their unwillingness to do what you want in the end, outlasts the patience of the American public. That happened in Vietnam, that happened in Iraq, that happened in effect in Afghanistan. And so when I hear these arguments about military force, and then I hear the voice, the rather eloquent voice of that gentleman, I'm very sympathetic to him because I have seen it again and again on the ground in my own reporting. I'm not talking here from the point of view of somebody who simply gazes at this and theorizes about it. I've been a war correspondent for the last 25 years. And the voice you just heard, the disappointment, the anger at perceived disrespect, is one I've heard again and again directed toward the United States and toward the American people. You know, that question you always hear, why do they hate us? Well, you just heard the answer to that in that voice.
This concludes the question and answer segment. Now we will have 2-minute closing statements by both speakers. And in the interest of fairness, this time we will begin with Professor Danner and conclude with Mr. Thiessen.
I think that I will be happy if people leave this chamber tonight going home to actually pursue these questions more deeply, to read about them, to learn about Iraq, to learn about the Islamic State, to learn about why the Iranians are now a force on the ground in Iraq. I have absolute confidence that the more you learn about recent history, the recent history that my friend and I have been discussing tonight, the more you will agree with what I have said, because what I have said is based on the recent history of what the United States has done since September 11, 2001. Those attacks were unmatched in their horror. The country, in a sense, is still horrified by them, but they didn't justify the kind of stupid foreign policy moves that came in their wake. And the Iraq War was the keystone stupid foreign policy move in the wake of September 11, 2001. Terrorism continues to be a threat, although I would say that it is a much exaggerated threat, but it is a threat. There's no question about that. And the United States is a great country if it responds wisely, in a limited fashion, but a powerful fashion, an intelligence fashion. It will keep Americans safe. The Islamic State is not Nazi Germany. The Islamic State is not the Soviet Union. The Islamic State can indeed be contained. The Islamic State can indeed be defeated. The only thing that can defeat the United States is the United States. That is, the only thing that can defeat the United States is if our leaders take actions that are self-defeating and that harm our national interests. We have seen that happen repeatedly since September 11th, 2001. Let's not have it happen again.
Thank you, Dr. Banner.
A movement that will take a man, put him in a cage, cover him with gasoline, and burn him alive and put a video of it on YouTube will do the same in our capital, in our country, if they're given a chance to do it. You cannot ignore this danger. And I'm sorry, when I hear Mr. Danner say that the terrorist threat is exaggerated, I was in the Pentagon on September 11, 2001. I felt the building shake, I smelled the smoke, I lost a good friend who was at the point of impact. Terror is not an exaggerated threat. This is a very, very real threat. And this kind of talk of terrorism being an exaggerated threat is precisely why we get into this danger. The war in Iraq, whether you agree with whether we should have started it or not, whether it was a wise move, it was won by the time the Bush administration left. And you don't have to believe me. Believe Joe Biden, who was trying to take credit for Iraq in 2011, who said this is going to be a great achievement of the Obama administration. He's not saying that anymore. This is a brutal, dangerous terrorist movement. It is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda that is so radical they broke off because poor Al-Qaeda that attacked us on 9/11 was too moderate. Okay? That's what we're dealing with here. Hundreds of millions of dollars in oil revenue, territory the size of Great Britain, and an intent and growing capability to attack us at home. We can follow Mr. Danner's policy and throw pinprick airstrikes at them and hope for the best, or we can do what's necessary to stop this threat before it comes to our shores. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thiessen. At this point, with your patience, we will conduct the poll very quickly one more time. So all people who are now for the motion, please raise your hands. Who are against the motion? And those who have become or remain undecided? At this point, I would like to entertain an individual from the Berkeley Forum who is going to recognizing both speakers with a small token of our appreciation. This is Matthew Freeman.
Actually, Daniel Aarons, but I just wanted Matthew Freeman's one above me. He was not quite his level yet. But I just wanted to thank the two guests who came out today. We have posters, as is Berkeley Forum tradition, that we typically give to our speakers as a token of them coming out. So, Mr. Danner, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Right, and before people leave, I do have a few ISI books to give away. We are also published books. If you look underneath your chair, we have 4 pieces of paper underneath chairs. If it says free book winner, please come see me after the event for free. Thank you all for coming.
On Thursday, there is going to be a post-debate forum, and I hope that all of you will come to that. It's here at 6 to 7 p.m. in 121 Wheeler. So if you would like to express your sentiments, perhaps we can come to some conclusions, though it was a very insightful event, and I thank both speakers for that. Please see the Facebook page for details on that. For this evening's debate.
In the hall, not use the podium.
Prior to the debate, there were 19% of you who voted for the motion, 41% who voted against the motion, and 41% who were unsure. After the debate, the results were as follows: 33% for the motion, 60% against the motion, and 6% who are unsure. Thank you.
I'm not sure what, I think we both pulled something to ourselves.
I think we did. I will have to. What's the number?